everybody. Seamus, thanks so much for plugging my work. I'm thrilled that you've read it, but what I really want to know is, did you buy it? I'll sign it if you buy it. So today is 9/11, and I can't start without mentioning that 18 years ago this morning, I was working in FBI Counter-Terrorism. I'd actually planned in advance to take a day off to finally take a day to just get a sense of where was I in writing my PhD. And we picked a random Tuesday 3 months away that I would finally take off and work on the PhD, and that was 9/11. So instead of working on the PhD, my pager went off, and before you knew it, we were all called in. At first, there were just 2 analysts assigned to the entirety of 9/11. Me and one other senior analyst were each given 2 flights, and that was literally impossible. So within 45 minutes, there were 2 other analysts. So now there was 1 analyst for each flight, which was no less impossible. And shortly afterwards, there were 10 to 15 people assigned to each team for the flight teams, and, well, you know what happened there. But Seamus is absolutely right. We're still dealing today with many of the same issues that caused the events 18 years ago, and we've only made so much progress. I'm very honored to be here. I have the honor of sitting on ICT's International Advisory Board. It's a pleasure to be here again. It's a pleasure to be here in a panel co-sponsored by the Program on Extremism, which does fabulous work and is led by good friends. I'm thrilled to see that you guys finally found in Devora an ICT person to actually make the program work. And I want to start off by being a little controversial. She didn't pay me to say that. Because if you're gonna deal with a problem, you have to be able to recognize the problem. And in the United States, this issue of dealing with terrorism that isn't coming from outside, but is a domestic issue, of people getting radicalized at home. And by the way, we have a huge problem of people getting radicalized to all kinds of ideologies. We have a massive domestic terrorism problem. I'm not going to deal with that right now. It's no less important, arguably maybe right now even a little more important. But if you can't recognize the problem for what it is, you're not going to be able or willing, or from a policy perspective, interested in dealing with it. And so I want to ask the question, is homegrown violent extremism truly homegrown? And the obvious answer, I think, is that yes, but here's why it matters. If you pretend that homegrown violent extremism isn't something that's happening at home, that you therefore don't have a domestic, in our case, American problem set, that it's only something, whether it's the idea or the people that are coming from abroad, you're going to apply different sets of solutions. It's going to be all about border security. It's going to be about immigration. And that might be a lot more comfortable to deal with, but it will not solve the problem. So, for example, the point is there was this focus on border security, on terrorism prevention, not only when there was attack abroad, but the president used it when he was talking about attack in New York City as well. And this was something that was part of a series. In February 2018, so just a few months later, the White House, in the context of this debate about chain migration, as the president put it, about the visa lottery system, about immigration in general, the president put this in very strict terrorism terms. And they put up a report on the White House website, National Security Threats, Chain Migration, and the Visa Lottery System, where they provided a list of people who had entered the United States from abroad, and all of the various types of terrorism or terrorism-related crimes for which they'd been convicted. Jeff Sessions and Nielsen from DHS, the president himself, you can see on the screen, had all these kind of bombastic quotes about it. But the problem was that if you actually went through the list of individuals in the report, the evidence didn't match the president's conclusions. What the president was trying to say is we have to be more careful. We can't let radical people into our country. We can't let dangerous people into our country. But I went through the list rather carefully, and what I found is that in all but maybe one case, and I can't say for sure in one case, but in every other case, all those people entered the United States, not radical. There was no evidence that they were radicalized in their home countries before they came here. And so what that means is that the immigration system with the exception of the few who came in illegally, but most came in legally, actually worked. The vetting system worked. We didn't, by mistake, let in radicals. But two, and more importantly, what it meant is that these people were radicalized in the United States. So this now is a truly homegrown, a domestic policy issue. Now that's sensitive, and you got to deal with it. It's a lot easier if you can point to it being someone else's problem. But it was not someone else's problem, it was our problem. And that shouldn't have surprised, because there are plenty of studies that the US government has done to demonstrate that actually very few people come into the United States already radicalized. But you might not have known that from this DOJ and DHS, Department of Justice and Homeland Security report, which concluded 3 out of 4 people were convicted of international terrorism and terrorism-related offenses were foreign-born. The problem is, and because you're using that fiasco against me on my time, I won't go into the detail, into as much detail, but the bottom line is this report was deeply, deeply flawed and was skewered by academics, and it wasn't that hard to do. And in fact, it's not true that 3 out of 4 individuals who were convicted of international terrorism and terrorism-related crimes in the United States were foreign-born. I'll give you just one tiny, incredible statistic. This number, 75%, includes people that the United States extradited from abroad. The only reason they came to the United States is because we reached out and grabbed them by the collar, forced them to come to the United States so that they could stand trial. Now that's fine. I'm all for extraditing bad guys and putting them in jail, but let's not pretend that that is an immigration. That's us. They didn't choose to come. And so if you look at some of the examples in the White House report, you're looking at people like Uzair Paracha, who came in 2006. There's no evidence that he was radicalized before he came in. Ali Shukri Amin came in 2015. A variety of cases, again, I'm not going to go into as much detail to make up the time because Seamus knows where I live. But the bottom line is, there was no evidence from the report they put up on the White House website that the cases they were citing in any way indicated the conclusions they were drawing. And if you look back at some of the earlier Homeland Security and other reports that were less politically charged, you can see that this shouldn't surprise. So this declassified intelligence assessment from DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis laid out very clearly that citizenship is likely an unreliable indicator of terrorist threat to the United States. It was very, very clear. Most foreign-born, US-based violent extremists likely radicalized several years after their entry into the United States, and the majority of individuals resided in the United States for more than 10 years before their indictment or death. Nearly all parents who entered the country with minor-aged children likely did not espouse a violent extremist ideology at the time they entered, or at any time since, suggesting these foreign-born individuals were likely not radicalized by their parents. They were radicalized by their experience in the United States. That's hard to hear, but that's something we need to hear and we need to deal with. Putting our head in the sand isn't going to help. The administration has since come out with a national security strategy and a national counterterrorism strategy, and it's a mixed bag. Both the national security strategy and the national counterterrorism strategy actually has some very, very good language regarding what I still refer to as countering violent extremism, but the administration, not liking the term, refers to as terrorism prevention. And in fact, you won't find the term CVE or even the term HVE, homegrown violent extremists, in these reports. The administration doesn't like the term HVE, which was a term coined by law enforcement, because people in the administration have said to me, why not just call them terrorists? Why make it sound like there's something softer than terrorism? But of course, that's not what HVE is about. It's just trying to describe the type of terrorists, that it's not foreign, it's homegrown, and that has some very significant policy ramifications. So you'll find language, as I pulled out here in this pull quote, on combating radicalization and recruitment in communities in the national security strategy. In the memo that they released to the press with their bullet points, they have some good stuff about isolating terrorists and protecting American infrastructure and putting America first, strengthening counterterrorism capabilities of our partners. But at the end of the day, there's not the same type of focus, not just on CVE, but even on HVE. You'll see in the counterterrorism strategy, it talks about as we face homegrown threats inspired by terrorist propaganda, they'll have that information in there with a footnote to talk about how some people use HVE as a term, even though we're not, but they don't go much into more detail than that. And here's the footnote right here where they explain intelligence and law enforcement communities refer to an individual in the United States radicalized and mobilized to violence by radical Islamist terrorist ideologies as homegrown violent extremists. They put that in a footnote because they're citing someone who refers to it, but otherwise it wasn't going to be in the report at all. And my fear is that that is just putting your head in the sand. Now, there's good parts to this too. I actually thought that the National Counter-Terrorism Strategy was going to be a lot less specific on the need to deal with terrorist radicalization and recruitment, and I was actually quite pleased at how much was in there. But if you put some language in there without a framework in which to deal with it, it's not clear that language is going to be translated into anything. So here you have the page and a half on their priority actions regarding to radicalization and recruitment, and that's good, but we haven't seen a whole lot of federal level action on this because there's not a whole lot of top-down White House, National Security Council interest in this. And so the most activity that's happening is at the state and local levels, and perhaps that is for the best. At the end of the day, at the Washington Institute, we've done now several series of what we call presidential studies on CVE. What we mean by that is we're a nonpartisan institute, and every 4 years we bring together Republicans and Democrats to do a bipartisan study so that whoever next occupies the White House, they'll have some bipartisan ideas and some difficult questions. This is the cover to the last bipartisan study group we did. And at the end of the day, one of the biggest takeaways, there were several others, one of the biggest takeaways that we had is that you really need to think about this problem set, at least in part, not only from a security perspective, but from a public health perspective. And a public health perspective demands looking at this from a domestic viewpoint. What is the nature of the problem in the United States? Let's put it bluntly. People who are born in the United States and people who immigrate to the United States are getting radicalized to violent extremism, both of a radical Islamist and other ideological isms of an international and domestic terrorist nature. They're getting radicalized in America with an American culture, not by ideas that are only coming from abroad and not by people who are only coming from abroad. And until we decide to grab that issue by the horns, we will not get ahead of the curve, and 18 years from today, we'll still be dealing with the same problems. Thank you very much.